Hi, everyone. I'm Corey Martin, the founder and CEO of Spotlight Safety. We're here to talk about one of my favorite topics, just going through communication challenges in safety programs, some of the common gaps that we find even in really effective safety programs, and thoughts on how to close those gaps. So we'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, as we're kind of thinking about common communication gaps, this is a slide that we put into every safety training that we do at Spotlight, and it really highlights communication as an essential component of safety programs. I equate this to location being the key for realtors. It really doesn't work as a safety program if you have communication silos or an inability to share really important understandings and observations across the organization and the overall landscape of the safety program. So, this is our go-to slide. We want people to be encouraged to ask for help. We want people to be empowered to communicate various safety issues and hazards. And there's a really important concept here of making sure that everyone in the organization is not only aware that they are required to report accidents or incidents, but also be made comfortable doing so. There's a lot of perception, which we'll get into in numbers, about whether or not it's a safe thing to do for their job or for the company to actually proactively communicate that accidents or incidents have happened. So, we want to make sure that people are stressing that as part of a safety program, and really encouraging groups to reach out and communicate effectively. So what are employees saying? So these are not, to be clear, Spotlight-derived data. These are materials that are out in the public domain. We know that this is a very difficult thing to find data on. It took us a long time to kind of curate this data. So if anyone out there wants to have these reference materials, we're happy to share them. You can feel free to reach out. Also, just generally, as we're going through these slides, if anyone wants to submit comments, I'm happy to take those in real time as we're going through these slides. But basically, what we're seeing in the space, about 46% of lab workers have reported sustaining at least one injury during their career in the lab. I know myself, I have certainly been in that category. It's one of those things that I think if you're in the space, you're not shocked by that number. I actually think it's probably maybe even a bit higher and might be depressed a little bit based on how people perceive what an injury or incident would be. So it's just something to continue to keep in mind that these are not necessarily very infrequent events, especially in a lab environment. 82% of workers who were questioned on this topic said that they felt disincentivized to report incidents. That disincentivization was a range of things, from penalties to potential job loss to funding sources. Some of these respondents were from the academic world, so it varies a lot in terms of what people were saying as the disincentive, but 82% is a very high number of respondents saying that they were discouraged or felt discouraged from reporting incidents. We have a lot of data on lone workers. So lone workers traditionally defined as the only person on site, or the only person doing a certain process in an area that they have limited help if something were to go wrong. About 20% of lone workers that were reviewed said that they had trouble getting help after an accident. About 44% of lone workers report feeling unsafe at work. So that's certainly something, that's a high enough category to really start to review what lone worker programs look like and what the communication channels are for those employees. Only about 17% of respondents to another study said that they were confident in their workplace's ability to track them if they were alone. So, we'll get into what the common lone worker type policies and programs look like, but there's a very clear need from a lot of these respondents to say something along the lines of, I feel like somebody is proactively keeping tabs on me while I'm alone. And if something were to go wrong, there's an automatic check-in system to provide support in that context. 56% of employees reported that they expected timely notification and updates if there's an emergency. So this is a employee expectation from their employer to give them timely updates if something is going wrong in the workplace. One of the things that happens after emergencies is that there's a lot of panic that develops. There's a lot of uncertainty about what to do, how to do it, and we'll talk about mass communication and mass notification channels as being an essential part of safety programs, because in most cases these are very siloed ways of communicating. It might be a Slack or a Teams or a mass email. It's going to be something that people are going to want to see and want to see timely updates. And depending on the system that you're using to deploy those, it can really either cause delays or confusion, especially if you're not able to capture everybody on site. So jumping into a couple of the more common gaps that we see: emergency response communication. How do you empower employees to have emergency responders mobilized? How do you, again, mass message to anyone on site at the facility? How do you check in with people who are on site when there's an evacuation and you need to take roll call? There are a lot of different systems for how to do these tasks. It's more about, do you have the right system for your program? Have you thought about it? Are there redundancies? If one person goes on vacation, does the whole system fall apart? It's really important to consider these items as you're going through the program review and making sure that you're identifying and capturing these gaps. So diving in a little bit on kind of 911 emergency medical response, I think when we see established programs, most employees know that they are empowered to call 911 as an initial response. There are some cases where it comes up that employees feel as though they need to go through the safety team or an emergency coordinator. In some cases, that might be the way that the program needs to operate for various reasons. But for the vast majority of programs, making sure that employees are encouraged and empowered to call 911 if there's a true medical emergency. The first priority is always to get first responders mobilized and on the way to the facility as things are happening. There's often a delay in terms of that initial notification to medical responders and getting the safety team looped in. That often comes about because there's a chaotic scene. There may be some panic. In some cases, there might be a doctor on site, but the safety team isn't part of that doctor group. There might be a first aid, CPR, AED team, but nobody knows necessarily in the moment how to get in touch with those key personnel. Typically on site, there would be a phone list or some sort of communication tree, but it's, in that moment where, there's a lot going on, a lot of high stakes, a lot of potential confusion. Knowing very clearly this is the communication channel, this is how you reach certain individuals, is a really important item to get not just trained on once, but also have those resources available, and in a lot of cases make sure that that system is robust enough to survive the chaos of those types of emergency response needs. The other item that we typically see get lost in the overall program is a clear understanding of which response facilities are appropriate for each type of an event. Again, there's often training, initially when the employee is onboarded, maybe annually for refresher training thereafter. But, it's not posted in a large number of places in most facilities where those appropriate response facilities are, and essentially what restrictions or drawbacks there might be at some facilities in terms of how effectively you can get supported. So for instance, there are some emergency urgent care occupational health type facilities that are incapable of taking eye injuries or incapable of taking certain levels of trauma. Those are very key elements to have the safety team and on-site responders aware of, so that you can direct the people to the correct facility in a timely fashion. Certainly the default is going to be the emergency room anytime there's something very serious, but understanding what other elements of those response needs might be restricted if you have some partner organizations that may not be able to take everything. Another element of this is making sure that the default in the employee's mind is not necessarily primary care physician if it's a less serious item, but that's still a workplace injury or condition. Those are things that we'll also want to go through the occupational health group initially for a lot of reasons, and then just making sure that that's clear and stated in the program is an important element. So mass messaging. This is going to be one of the top, I would say, 3 gaps that we see in most safety programs, even if they're well established, otherwise regulatory compliant, is they are typically lacking on a very dedicated mass messaging system that's for safety communication channels. The reason why I say dedicated is a lot of times this is a Slack channel that people get hit with so many messages throughout the day or throughout the week that you get desensitized to it. So it's really important in a lot of our contexts to have a dedicated communication channel for mass messaging and safety updates. A really key consideration here is how long does it take to activate? If it's going to take 15 minutes to get a message out, and there's a very urgent, timely need to get that message out, that 15 minutes is a lot of valuable time, and in a lot of cases might not be sufficient for the level of communication that's needed. Who can activate it is always a key consideration. So is it just the safety team? Is it the safety team in the front desk? Is it safety team security? Is it HR? There are a lot of considerations on which groups should be able to activate that program, and what kinds of redundancies do you need to have in that system, but also considering, is this something that could be abused if somebody in one of those silos wanted to use it for a nefarious reason? So both sides of that equation need to be carefully considered. Do the messages go to everybody? And when I say everybody, is that just employees? Does that include contractors? Does that include visitors? Most of the programs that we reviewed do not capture contractors and visitors, and potentially would be a gap if you have a contractor working in some area of the facility that wasn't actively part of that communication channel. Another consideration is whether it's a one-way or two-way communication. If it only goes out and you can't get anything back, that's something that could need to be reviewed in terms of how effective that communication actually is. Who manages the list? So typically when we see these programs, it's either some sort of app-based or in a lot of cases still paper format. Who's updating those? If you need to get people into the system, is that an active thing? Is it a monthly update so that the new hires aren't in the system until a month into their tenure there? Often those are going to be the employees that need the most assistance during an emergency response scenario to know where to go and how to proceed. Are they included in the communication channels from day one? And has it ever been tested, right? So, oftentimes we'll have groups do annual fire drills or, do a tabletop or something along those lines. But, how robustly is that emergency response communication system tested, trained on? Do you have Wi-Fi gaps in your facility or cell phone gaps in your facility if you're using something mobile? That would impact the ability to get that communication out to everybody. The evacuation roll call item, always, a pretty key item here in terms of, everyone needs one. It's something that you want to be robust in terms of how confident you are that you've captured everybody. So, who's responsible for taking roll call? If that person's out on vacation, does that whole system fall apart? Who is trained to determine or review those lists and make sure that if anyone's out of office or on vacation, that they're accounted for as well. Again, there's that update requirement for managing the list and making sure new hires and those types of people are accounted for. And again, it's a training and testing piece as well. If anyone's watching and wants to have questions submitted about that, I can go into a little bit more detail about how we typically approach those kinds of gaps. But if not, I'll shift over into the incident reporting element, which is another kind of key barrier. One of the things for incident reporting for us is it's very easy to navigate the incident reporting process and follow up when the safety team is notified. And the challenge tends to be understanding from the full scope of the program what needs to be communicated to the safety team and when. I think we've all been in that scenario where we have a monthly safety committee and somebody raises an issue and it says, yeah, 2 weeks ago we had a big chemical spill, and everyone looks around and says, well, that wasn't on anyone's radar. How was that managed? And where did we go wrong in the incident reporting process to drop something like that? So, typically when we are evaluating these programs, it's what's the barrier to the initial reporting. If it's a really complex process for the overall incident reporting process in terms of who reviews it, how many people get to weigh in, what the corrective actions are, that can be fine as long as you're not eliminating the initial reporting element. If it doesn't get from the initial person who had the incident to the person who is managing that follow-up process, that's where the biggest barrier and gap tends to be. A lot of times it's simply they don't know what they need to communicate, and they don't have a sense of, okay, these are all of the items that fit into the incident near miss hazard observation category and what needs to go to the safety team or whatever kind of group is managing that particular reporting structure. A lot of times it's about limited access to the reporting channels. So, if it's a paper form somewhere and nobody knows where the somewhere is, that becomes the barrier to the incident reporting. And now you're asking somebody to go out of their way to try to find the way to report the incident. We mentioned the 82% of people who feel like there would be some sort of negative consequence. Is there a perception of consequence or penalty in the reporting process? It really is important as an overall safety program to eliminate those types of perceptions. There's the whole day since incident deterrent that I think is well known across the safety space. But is there a fear of letting other team members down by reporting incidents? We've seen groups go with the pizza party for, no incident quarters. Are you doing something in that type of incentive program, which is well intentioned and, should be, a form of celebration, when you truly eliminate those types of concerns, but are you repressing some of this reporting that would be important down the road for capturing, some of those near misses, some of those minor incidents before they build up to become a much more serious incident down the road? And then I think a lot of times there's just general embarrassment. Nobody wants to admit that they, dropped something by accident, or often in my experience, it's been slip, trip, and fall type injuries where somebody trips over a rug, they get embarrassed, they don't report it. And, a lot of times in those cases, slip, trip, and falls come in more than one incident because the same hazard is still there if you haven't reported it. And if that rug is curled up and somebody else trips over it, now you have a scenario where the severity of it could escalate if it's not taken care of. So when we really look at these programs and try to identify the gaps, it's, can we reduce this down to making the initial reporting process as simple as possible? If it's harder than a text, it might be too complicated and you might be losing some of these initial hazard observation, certainly minor incidents, because of that. So for us, it's all about making that initial communication as simple as possible. Along the lines of communication and reporting, typically hazard observations or what people perceive as unsafe conditions, it can be important to, and in some cases required, to enable some sort of anonymous reporting channel. This can be a sensitive subject. Certainly there are, ways of doing it well and ways to, again, lead to this perception of negative consequence if you don't do it well. But there have been a lot of cases where anonymously reported tips or hazard observations have been a really good tool for improvement, especially if you're dealing with a workplace culture that is in that we're not really sure how coming forward is going to be perceived at the moment. So certainly, at the initial phase of we're looking to make some improvements in the overall safety program, enabling something in a good context can start the process. Now, I mentioned that some of these items are required. So in the context of animal care facilities, there is a whistleblower policy requirement. If you're under, IACUC type control, that anonymous reporting is under the whistleblower policy. That particular channel is a requirement for those programs. The most common solution that we typically see in workplaces is the anonymous Dropbox approach. It's easy to set up. People understand the concept. However, as well-intentioned as they tend to be, it's unclear to most folks who respond to us as to how anonymously they really are communicating through that channel. We've seen people post these Dropboxes in very public areas of the office. Obviously, that's going to discourage somebody from going and dropping off a note if they're concerned about that. They've been in hallways where there are security cameras, and that creates concern. So keeping that in mind as a potential disincentive to using that type of process is an important item. So, really from our side of the equation, anything nowadays that's electronic communication that can be blinded tends to be a really good option for those types of anonymous reporting channels. For us, the other component of this that is important if you're setting up a channel like this is to make sure that people who are submitting the anonymous tips know that they are being reviewed and that actions are being taken if it's a true, element that needs to be followed up on. When it's a feasible thing to show that, hey, these tips are coming in, we are taking them seriously, we are acting on them and making improvements to the safety program. That's an important component of this. Otherwise, people will look at the Dropbox as okay, I put something in there, nothing ever happens, so I'm just not going to use that channel anymore. So really valuable when used properly, but there are some potential drawbacks or things that people aren't quite considering when setting up these particular communication channels. For lone worker support, so obviously we spent a lot of time in the statistics category on lone worker support. By far the most common policy that we see in the vast majority of workplaces that we review is that no one has a formal policy for how to account for lone workers, especially earlier stage companies, setting it up for the first time. They're just not developing a system, or they have a rudimentary system, but it's not clearly being followed. The initial system that we see be the most popular is an email in, email out, or Slack in, Slack out, Teams in, Teams out, whatever communication channel you typically use. That's either going to the supervisor when you get in and then leave, or the safety team when you get in, when you leave, security desk, on the way up, on the way down. Those tend to start the process for a lone worker support program. The challenge is if it's a long window of time, you can miss really important updates. If somebody's going to be in there for 5 minutes and you don't, hear back from them in 5 minutes, that's one thing. If they're going to be there all afternoon on a Saturday, well, what happens if they have an issue in the first 30 minutes of that window? You're not going to know about it until, the checkout time or whatever they kind of indicated would be when they were going to leave and when they were going to check back in. That can be a large delay, especially if it's a medical emergency or even just a slip, trip, and fall, before they are actually accounted for and get help. What happens if they forget to message out? I think we see this a lot in these types of systems where, somebody forgets to message out. It's 10 o'clock on a Friday and nobody thinks to check in with them until the following Monday. That's a near miss, right? So if you are relying on this check-in, check-out system and nobody's aware that anybody, failed to check out after 10 p.m. on a Friday, and it goes, 48 hours before anyone, comes in and, understands that there was a miss there, that can be a big hole in that particular type of a program. The other element of this is, do you review a functional work alone scenario? So when I say functional work alone, you are there with other people in the facility, but there's no one there to help you if you need help, right? So if you're the only one in the facility with lab access and you have to key card in and no one else in the facility at that time has the ability to go and get you if you need help, you're functionally working alone in that scenario. If you're a facilities team member and you have to go on the roof every once in a while and you're one of the only people or the only person in the facility with access to the roof, the ability for others to help you drops a lot. So this is true of animal care facilities, clean room access, any type of internal access to the facility that only a subset of the employee population has access to is worth reviewing in these contexts. And then certainly, your after hours support staff, your janitorial staff that might come in after hours, or your security staff that's 24/7, if they're doing rounds in those spaces, they're higher risk spaces, do they have a check-in system? Do people know, what their timelines are? How would they get help if they needed help? Those are other gaps that we typically see in terms of the lone worker support program. An element here that's often overlooked as well is how quickly you are instituting corrective actions and actually following up on incidents. There's very little more damaging to the safety program than having plans to make improvements and then not having them go anywhere. So it really is important, if you've set corrective actions, if you are going to make improvements to the safety program, to actually follow through. The other element of this that is important, especially for newer programs, is this is a team effort, right? So there have been cases where really important corrective action items need to be addressed, and it's more of a safety will fix that eventually approach, right? So that's siloing it. It's not having everyone involved in the process taking ownership of it. We really want to make sure that that's not the automatic approach. Certainly the safety team can provide support, can help track the initiatives and make sure that they're moving forward, but it can't just be an EHS or safety driven item. It's important also to learn from everything you can. Incidents, near misses, observations, requests from people, these are all indications that something needs to be improved. And in those cases, the more you can do to discuss them, learn from them, move them forward, encourage more of that type of reporting, that's really the hallmark of a really effective program. So as you're going through corrective actions, set goals, set timelines, make them clear, make sure that people know who's responsible for what, communicate across the group what the goals are, how the check-in and review and update process is going to happen. And then at the end of the day, it needs to get done. If it's been deemed an important improvement item, if it falls off the radar, if it doesn't get done, that's going to create this perception that it's not a priority, and or you can communicate all you want, but it's not going to go anywhere, and people aren't going to follow through with it. So the last topic that I want to talk about here is how to effectively involve upper management. It's very, very, very common for safety programs to be siloed in certain areas of the company or the organization and not have communication channels out of that silo. It really does take two-way communication in order to make that happen. It has to be a point of emphasis for all parties. But we want to make sure that you're using some sort of safety committee liaison or an upper management rotation through communication channels. We use the institutional official model in our head a lot of times when we're putting that into place. So if you're not familiar with animal care facilities and IACUC programs, there's always a higher level employee within the company, an official within the company that has to take on ownership of that program. We like to see that type of process, not just for animal care facility contexts, but throughout the safety program. Really just who the upper management type advocate is for the safety program. It is really important as safety professionals to control the metrics. So if you don't control the metrics, it's very common for the KPI, so key performance indicator, to become how many incidents have we had. If we haven't had any incidents, then we have a perfect safety program. If we have had a lot of incidents, what is safety doing, right? So we want to make sure that we're avoiding that particular metric as the sole metric for how we're measuring the effectiveness of the safety program. The more you can make them proactive, the more that you can make them measurable, the better. We like to have KPIs be in the context of corrective actions, incident follow-up closeout rate, what is the time to correction or closeout of those types of items. That's putting it in your kind of hands as to how quickly you can move through things. You can demonstrate with numbers, percentage rates, and days to completion. There are a lot of ways that you can make that effective. I also like to have a ratio of hazard observations and near misses to more of the injurious incidents. They're going to ask for incidents. There's not really a way around that. The more you can do to kind of show, hey, here are all the proactive things that we corrected to the incidents, that can be a really valuable ratio to show that you're being proactive and doing what you can to reduce or minimize the likelihood of an incident without going too far down that. For specialty or hands-on training completion, the biggest goal or gap that we see in a lot of programs on the training front is it's a one-time classroom training, maybe once a year. There's not a lot of follow-up or hands-on training throughout the year to provide some follow-up, some incentivizing communication, things in their kind of bubble, and then go from there. Another really important part with involving upper management in this is advocating for inclusion. I think a lot of times things come to the safety team a little bit too late, or there's not really a clear communication channel for, hey, we have this new program coming online or this new piece of equipment that we're looking to bring on board. In those types of cases, if safety is not involved early on, then you can sometimes get into the fallacy of being always the person or team that's creating barriers later, right? So if you're not proactive about it, if you're not helping facilitate those types of programs or pieces of equipment, or making sure that everything's correct and in place, once it comes to them for review and all they're doing is saying, okay, we can't do this, or we need to go back to the drawing board, or we need to delay this a little bit, it really puts safety in the position of being the barrier rather than the helper. Anything you can do to get involved in those processes sooner will really go toward making you more of a helper than a barrier. It's also not generally the case that safety is visible when things are going right. It's almost always the case that safety is highlighted when there are incidents and emergencies and things that don't go perfectly, right? So when possible, highlighting the good in the program. So, hey, we had a good catch. We had a near miss that, we followed up on correctly. Now we have that potential gap in the program fixed. Those are the types of things that we want to make sure that people are approaching the safety program with the mindset of, and not only harping on the safety negatives when there are emergencies or incidents. So anything proactive, anything like those good catch programs, proactive JSAs, job safety analyses, or risk assessments, completion targets. If you say, hey, every month we're going to knock off a new JSA or risk assessment, that's a trackable goal. That's an improvement and a proactive item that can give you something to hang your hat on when you're effectively talking to upper management about how the safety program is going. And the last thought, I know some people may need to log out. This program will remain live on LinkedIn and our YouTube channel. So that's something that you can catch up on after if you need to head out early. But the last point here that I really want to make is, safety culture can be a valuable retention tool. I don't think a lot of groups are viewing it that way, but good employees value safety. They value proactive communication. They value not having the what ifs going on as they are, working in this space. So, some of these facilities have high hazards. In order to do the work, you have to have high hazards. The more you can do to make sure that everyone feels comfortable in that context, you can really isolate that as a retention tool. And that can be something that can help drive the communication with upper management when they start seeing it that way. A very strong majority, so Spotlight does safety culture assessments with groups. A very high percentage of respondents say that they would leave their current role if they started having concerns about the safety program. So that is something to, certainly in the context of retaining high caliber talent, you want to make sure that you are including the safety program in that context, because it really is part of overall company culture. It's not a separate thing. I think a lot of times people refer to safety culture as a standalone type item. It is part of a dedicated safety program, but it really needs to be incorporated into the overall safety culture or company culture to allow it to be effective. And I think it's not a safety as the barrier to operations. It's not as safety as a completely separate track as operations. It really needs to be reframed into the, these are operations that we need to do safely, rather than safety becoming the barrier to operations. Safe programs are generally much more efficient and productive than unsafe programs. You don't have to deal with stoppages. You don't need to deal with, employees who are less incentivized to move things forward, to communicate things, to eliminate barriers to productivity before they happen. So this is a really important element of that overall process. So I know we went a little over. Does anyone have comments? Feel free to submit those. Otherwise, happy to take questions. You can feel free to reach out if it's about any questions, if it's about, those reference materials that I referenced earlier. I also want to just highlight, we are actively looking for solutions to these problems. So we are developing, a mobile app to put the tools and some of these communication channels in the hands of every employee in companies, and we want to make sure that people are empowered to communicate effectively throughout the program, throughout the organization, and making sure that the safety program is capturing the things that need to be captured. Excellent. I'm not seeing any questions, but again, feel free to reach out, and thank you all for your time.